Story 1. The Man in the Red Pickup. I was 12, the year a stranger tried to enter our home in the most ordinary sunlit hour of the afternoon. It happened in Ash Grove, a scattered little town in Arkansas where houses were separated by long stretches of grass and thin woods. From my upstairs window, the world always looked wide and harmless, like nothing truly dangerous could ever find its way there. My grandma had dropped me off at 3, like she did every weekday. That autumn was the first time my parents trusted me to stay alone after school. My dad wasn't due home from the lumber mill until 7, and my mom had parent-teacher conferences that evening. In my 12-year-old mind, 4 hours felt insignificant. I ran upstairs, dropped my backpack, turned on the old Xbox 360, and joined my friend Cole in Minecraft. The glow of the pixelated world replaced the silence of the empty house, and everything felt as simple as it always had. 2 hours passed without me noticing. The air conditioner hummed, cicadas droned outside, and the sun slanted through the blinds in long, pale stripes. It was peaceful until the quiet outside cracked. A car door slammed somewhere below. It wasn't loud, but it was wrong. My dad had no reason to be home. My mom even less. I paused the game and drifted toward the window overlooking the driveway, expecting to see a familiar car. Instead, a faded red pickup sat in the center of the driveway, angled sideways, not parked so much as dropped there. It looked old and sun-bleached, the kind of truck that had seen a lifetime of hauling and dirt roads. I didn't recognize it. Nobody in my family owned anything like it. A man stepped out. He wore a thick camouflage hoodie. Despite the 90-degree heat, the hood pulled halfway up as if he were trying to conceal his face. Jeans hung stiff on his legs. For a moment, I watched him move, hoping to find something familiar in the way he walked, but nothing matched anyone I knew. He headed straight toward the front door. I stood frozen inside my room. If he had been a friend of my dad's, I would have recognized at least the truck. My dad always warned me when someone might stop by. That day, he hadn't mentioned anyone. The knock that followed carried up the staircase, firm and methodical. I didn't answer. I didn't even breathe. Seconds later, as if deciding the attempt was pointless, the man stepped off the porch and headed back down the walkway. From the second window in my room, I caught him again. He wasn't returning to his truck. Instead, he walked past it, moving toward the side of the house where the garage's side entrance sat. A cold heaviness settled in my stomach. That particular door was the one we used most often, the one most likely to be forgotten. I leaned forward just in time to see the man reach for the handle. He twisted, pulled, pushed, and tried again with more force, as if expecting it to eventually give. The metal groaned, but held. For a moment, he stood completely still. The yard around him buzzed with the usual sounds of late afternoon. But beneath it, I sensed a deliberate patience in him. Not frustration, just calculation. He turned away from the garage and walked toward the backyard. I abandoned my headset and crept downstairs, each step deliberate to keep the wood from creaking. I pressed myself against the wall by the living room where I could listen without being visible through any window. The sliding glass door behind the house had the widest, clearest view inside. Anyone standing on the porch could see straight into the living room and part of the kitchen. I waited, breath shallow. The door handle jiggled. It was gentle at first, like a person testing whether a lock they hadn't expected might resist. Then a second attempt. Then a heavy sound, something solid landing on the concrete outside. Maybe a brick. Maybe a tool. Whatever it wasn't meant for anything good. He stayed there for what felt like an eternity. The only proof of his presence was the soft scrape of something shifting against the doorframe. I could picture him checking the corners, examining every inch, deciding where his best chance of entry would be. With each passing second, the house felt more fragile, like its thin walls were holding back something far more determined than a regular intruder. And then, as abruptly as it began, the sounds stopped. Silence settled thickly. I dared to lean forward, catching a sliver of the porch through the curtain of the sliding door. He had vanished. I rushed back up the stairs and returned to my earlier vantage point. A moment later, the slam of a truck door echoed up the driveway. From my window, I saw him settle behind the wheel of the red pickup. He didn't start the engine immediately. He just sat there, motionless, almost contemplative. The bed of the truck held only two objects, a shovel and a crowbar. Nothing else. No toolkit, no construction materials, just the unmistakable shape of metal meant for prying and digging. Eventually, the engine turned over. The truck backed out, paused at the end of the road, then disappeared toward the woods. I waited until the last trace of red vanished before daring to go downstairs again. The back porch told the whole story. The doormat had been peeled back and shoved to the side. Both large flower pots, usually too heavy for me to lift alone, had been dragged out of position, leaving perfect dust rings behind. He had searched under them for a key. We did keep a spare key back there, but not under the large pots. My father had placed it beneath a small clay pot on the raised edge of the brick ledge by the door. That little pot was the only one untouched. The front porch was the same. Pots shifted, mat askew, everything slightly off from its usual place. He had checked every hiding spot except the correct one. I called my father using the landline in the kitchen, my voice trembling as I tried to describe everything: the truck, the man, the attempted doors, the way he had inspected our property like he already belonged inside it. My dad came home instantly, and so did a police officer. I repeated every detail. Notes were taken. A patrol car drove through the area for the next few nights. The red truck never returned. We changed the locks the next morning. My dad moved the spare key and bought heavy metal bars for the back door. For weeks afterward, every creak in the house felt like a warning. Now, years later, I live far from Ash Grove, but sometimes, when I hear a car door close on a quiet afternoon, or see an unfamiliar pickup idling a little too long on a street, that feeling from age 12 returns. The sunlight doesn't make the world safer. The hour of the day doesn't matter. Sometimes danger walks straight up to your door in broad daylight, patient enough to search every flower pot in your yard. Some people only fear ghosts. I fear the man who nearly found the key to my home, and if he had searched just an inch further, might have ended my story before it ever had the chance to be told. Story 2. The DVD from the night market. For years afterward, Lena would think back to the moment her brother placed the cheap plastic game case on the coffee table and realize the story had already begun. There was nothing special about the case itself, just a faded cover with the title Silent Woods 2 printed in shaky letters, but it held the kind of danger that never announces itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as something small, harmless, unimportant. Her mother had left only 2 days earlier on a long flight to Germany to visit Lena's grandparents. The apartment felt different without her, colder and far too still. Lena noticed it that first evening alone with her brother. The refrigerator hummed in a way it never seemed to when their mother was home, and every sound in the hallway outside felt sharper. Derek liked to fill empty space, and the night market had become his answer to every boredom. He came home that afternoon with a backpack full of bootleg games and counterfeit accessories, proud of the bargains he had made. He invited his friend Amir over, and together they dug through their new haul as though it were treasure. Lena watched from the couch, only mildly interested, until Derek held up the game with the shaky handwriting on the spine. They decided to test it before their mother returned. The plan was simple: pop in the disc, see if it worked, then bring it back to the vendor if it didn't. In their minds, nothing truly sinister ever came from a cheap disc bought from a folding table covered with tarp under flickering market lights. But when the PlayStation spun the disc and revealed not a game menu but a list of video files, the room seemed to shift. The boys laughed at first, annoyed that they had been tricked, but curiosity outweighed frustration. They settled on the floor. Lena remained on the couch, watching from above, like an outsider observing a ritual she hadn't meant to join. The first video looked amateurish, grainy footage of an empty street, illuminated by the orange haze of old lamps. The camera moved slowly, almost cautiously. Two young women appeared on screen, walking with unsteady steps, their laughter barely audible over the muffled audio. They disappeared into a building at the end of the street, and the camera followed from a distance. The second video moved from eerie to invasive. The camera held steady on a door lock, while two gloved hands worked a pick. The tumblers clicked out of place, and the door swung open. The figure behind the camera stepped inside a dark living room, breathing heavily, lingering over objects that belonged to someone who clearly had no idea they were being watched. The footage cut abruptly. The next videos grew darker. Each one followed a new woman through nighttime streets, their routines unknowingly documented in unsettling detail. A grocery bag, a key turning in a lock, a living room light turning on moments meant to be private. None of them as private as the women assumed. As the three teens continued watching, their living room felt smaller. The walls of the apartment seemed to inch inward with every new clip. The final video began with a familiar coat and familiar luggage. The camera had captured a woman heading down the street towards an airport taxi. Her posture, her stride, the way she lifted her bag into the trunk, Lena recognized every inch of her. It was her mother. The footage had been taken days earlier, at the exact moment Lena and Derek had waved goodbye from the balcony. Something primal shifted inside her then. The knowledge that the faceless person behind the camera had stood within feet of her family, close enough to reach out, close enough to follow her mother all the way to the curb. It broke the world, she understood. None of them slept at home that night. They took the disc and went straight to Amir's house across town, trying to convince themselves they were only being cautious. The apartment felt unsafe now, like the air itself had been contaminated. Morning light brought little comfort. They returned only long enough to gather more clothes and check the apartment's condition. Nothing appeared disturbed until Lena entered her bedroom. The writing on the wall stopped her breath. Across the painted space above her bed stretched a message in red. The smell revealed it wasn't blood, but nail polish, her nail polish that had been smeared across the plaster. The implication was worse than if it had been real blood. Someone had taken their time, chosen something intimate, and used it knowingly. The police arrived but dismissed the evidence as an elaborate prank between siblings. They barely glanced at the DVD. To them, it was cheap contraband purchased by teenagers with too much imagination. Lena felt something inside her collapse at the realization that no one believed her. Back at Amir's house, she decided she needed proof. She took the DVD, the only remaining record of the stranger's obsession, and set up an old laptop in her bedroom before they left the apartment again. She turned on its webcam and connected it to her personal laptop using a remote access program. If anyone entered her room, she would know. If anyone returned to write more on her walls, she would see. That night, she opened her laptop and watched the grainy footage of her empty room. Her bed sat untouched. Her closet was closed. For a long time, the screen showed nothing but an ordinary space, in an ordinary apartment. Then a shadow crossed the far wall. Before she could react, the remote laptop displayed a notification that a USB device had been inserted. Her heart dropped as a new video file opened by itself. The image showed her own back as she walked down the hallway of her building the night before, luggage in hand. The camera had been behind her close enough that she should have felt someone breathing against her spine. Everything she had feared became undeniable. On the stream from her bedroom, another message had appeared below the first, written in the same red polish. The sight of it drained the warmth from her hands. At that exact moment, downstairs in Amir's house, the front door clicked faintly, the sound of metal turning against metal. They were supposed to be alone. The house should have been silent. The realization hit Lena with full force. Someone had followed them. Someone had watched them leave the apartment, followed them across town, and now stood inside another home entirely. The night ended in police lights and hurried instructions. The disc shattered at some point, whether by accident or someone's deliberate action, Lena never learned. Without it, everything felt like a half-remembered nightmare. The officers once again dismissed her fear as teenage exaggeration. There was no evidence left to convince them. Yet Lena carried the truth alone. Someone had watched her mother enter her room, filmed her movements, stood behind her as she fled the apartment, and then walked into another house in the middle of the night. The presence had followed her like a shadow, with intent patient enough to wait and silent enough to remain unseen. Years later, she would still think about the man behind the camera. Not the videos, not the writing. Him. Whoever he was, whatever he wanted, and how close he had come to taking something from her family before anyone realized the danger. Some horror stories grow fangs or claws in retellings. Hers never needed them. A camera, a key, and quiet footsteps in the hall had been enough to haunt her long after the night market and its counterfeit games had disappeared from her life. Story 3: The Night the Dog Saved Me. Evan had always thought of their quiet suburban street as the safest place in the world. Palm trees, trimmed lawns, houses that looked nearly identical under the warm California sun, everything about it suggested calm predictability. By the time he was 16, he could map every crack in the sidewalk and every hedge trimmed low along the fences. Nothing ever changed, and he believed nothing dangerous could ever slip unnoticed into a place so ordinary. His parents left early on a Thursday morning for a trip up to Monterey, reminding him to keep the doors locked and not to stay up too late. He spent the day as any teenager would, gaming, eating junk food, tossing a ball to Bear in the backyard. Bear was nearly 90 pounds of tan fur and unwavering loyalty. The dog seemed too gentle for anything violent, but too protective to ever stand by if something went wrong. The first day alone passed without incident. The house remained bright, sun-filled, and normal. It wasn't until late the next night that the atmosphere began to shift. Just before midnight, the storm clouds rolled in. Not a real storm, just the usual coastal weather, damp air, a little wind, nothing more. Evan was half asleep on the couch, scrolling through his phone, when Bear's head lifted sharply. The dog wasn't barking, only listening muscles stiff. A soft, rhythmic tapping drifted through the room. It was so delicate at first that Evan thought it might be a branch brushing the siding. But their house didn't have any trees close enough for that. The sound repeated slow and deliberate against the front door. Bear's ears stood up. His body leaned toward the noise, tense yet silent. That was what unnerved Evan more than the tapping itself. Bear rarely growled, rarely reacted to anything besides squirrels or the mail truck, and yet his entire posture had changed. The sound faded after a few minutes, Nothing else happened. Evan eventually returned to his video, telling himself it had been the wind. But long after the tapping stopped, Bear remained alert, staring at the door as though something invisible lingered behind it. The next day was hot, oppressive, and strangely quiet. Evan and Bear played in the backyard until the heat drove them back inside. It wasn't until later that afternoon that Evan noticed the side gate standing open. The padlock his father always used hung bent, its metal bowed outward like someone had forced it open with a tool. The concrete beneath was marked with faint, muddy impressions. The sight chilled him. His father always locked that gate. Always. There was no scenario where it would be left unsecured. He told himself it might have been the landscapers, or the meter reader, or maybe the lock had been older than anyone realized and finally gave way. But none of those explanations felt right. Something about the angle of the lock suggested pressure force in tension. Evan secured the gate as best he could and went back inside. Night settled early that evening. He double-checked the doors, drew the curtains, and left only one lamp on in the living room, where he settled with Bear stretched across the rug. The dog shifted constantly, ears flicking at every creak or rustle outside. Around 1 in the morning, the quiet fractured again. This time the sound didn't come from the front door. It came from the sliding glass door that opened to the backyard, soft, thin strokes like fingernails dragging across the glass. Bear launched into a full-throated bark, charging toward the sound. The sudden outburst knocked Evan's breath out of his chest. He grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a broom, and flicked on the backyard lights. In the flood of brightness, he caught a fleeting glimpse of someone sprinting across the grass toward the fence. A human figure, quick and purposeful. A white shirt, dark shorts. Something metallic glinting as the person vaulted over the fence and disappeared. When the police arrived 15 minutes later, the intruder was long gone. They found only a set of footprints near the edge of the yard, half sunk in the dirt. They suggested it was probably just a prowler, someone testing houses at night. They told him to keep his doors locked and call back if anything else happened. The reassurance did little to ease the dread that had settled in his ribs. By the next evening, exhaustion made his eyelids heavy, but fear kept him moving. He checked every window, every lock. He pushed a wooden dowel against the sliding door track for extra security. Bear paced alongside him, restless in a way that made Evan's pulse jump. He finally went to bed around 11. Bear curled at his side, though he didn't relax like usual. His breathing stayed low and vigilant. A sound woke Evan sometime after 3 in the morning, sharp, harsh, unmistakable. Gravel shifting. The driveway outside carried footsteps that moved with purpose. Slow, unhurried. The side gate creaked open. Every inch of Evan's body froze. He tightened his grip on the aluminum baseball bat he kept beside the nightstand. Bear rose immediately, fur bristling, a growl vibrating deep in his chest. The footsteps crossed the backyard, steady and confident, then stopped directly outside Evan's bedroom window. The thin glass was all that separated him from whoever stood there. The air grew thick with tension. Bear stepped forward, snarling louder. Another sound floated through the wall, low, controlled, unmistakably human. Evan's blood turned cold. Bear erupted. He hurled himself at the window frame, his bark erupting so violently it swallowed every other sound. Outside, footsteps retreated. The yard went silent. The intruder had not entered, but he hadn't run far. The sense of someone watching remained pressed against the dark. Daylight didn't erase the terror. Damp earth beneath the window revealed fresh prints. Bare feet pressed deep into the soil. Not shoes, not boots. Bare feet. The imprint of toes curled slightly in the dirt. Evan didn't tell his parents. He didn't want to ruin their trip. He didn't want them to worry about something he hoped would simply cease if ignored. That final night proved how wrong he was. The shattering glass jolted him awake, a violent explosion of sound from the living room. Bear tore from the bedroom before Evan could even stand. He grabbed the bat with trembling hands and stepped into the hall as the sounds of chaos erupted. Heavy footsteps thudded across the floor. The smell of sweat and damp grass rushed into the hallway. Bear's growling became a frantic roar. A man's voice answered low and furious, followed by the violent crash of a body slamming into furniture. Evan moved toward the noise, heart pounding so fiercely he thought it might burst. He turned the corner just as Bear lunged, jaws locked around a stranger's arm. The intruder staggered, swinging a metal bar wildly. Bear held on, dragging the man backward, refusing to let go despite the blows. Something primal overtook Evan. He rushed forward and swung the bat with every ounce of strength his body could muster. The impact cracked through the room. The man stumbled, wrenched himself free of Bear's grip, and fled through the broken sliding door, disappearing into the yard with blood trailing behind him. The police arrived for the second time in 3 days. This time, they stayed longer. They documented everything. They took samples from the blood smeared on the floor. One officer knelt beside Bear, who whimpered softly but wagged his tail despite a deep cut in one ear. 2 days later, a detective called with news a man had been arrested in a neighborhood not far away, caught trying to force his way into another home. He matched every detail. He had a record of burglary and assault. His forearm bore fresh, deep bite marks. Bear's bite. Evan never saw the man again, but the memory of those nights clung to him through the years. Even long after Bear passed away from old age, he felt the dog's presence whenever he walked past the oak tree in their backyard where they buried him. Sometimes when the wind rattled a window or a pebble clicked against the siding, Evan still remembered the bare footprints beneath his window, the shattered glass, and the frantic strength of the dog that refused to let evil pass beyond the living room floor. Some people say instinct is a myth. Evan never believed that again. Bear had sensed danger the very first night. Bear had known something was wrong long before Evan dared to accept it. And in the end, Bear had saved his life. Story 4. The Thing That Came Down the Stairs. Jamie always thought the house felt too big at night. It was a simple 2-story place on a quiet street in Eugene, Oregon. But when her mother worked the overnight shift at the hospital, the halls stretched longer, the corners seemed darker, and the silence pressed harder against the walls. Her father had been gone for years, and on nights like this, the absence felt sharper. Her mother left around 10:15 already in her scrubs, offering tired instructions about locking the doors and not staying up too late. Then the door closed. The car engine faded down the street, and Jamie was alone with the hum of the fridge, the ticking clock, and Milo, their brown mutt, snoring softly in the corner. She settled onto the living room couch, turned down the lights, and put on a true crime documentary. The blue wash of the television painted everything in shifting shadows. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, making the house creak in familiar ways. It should have been soothing. It almost was. At some point, boredom and restlessness tugged at her. She thought about the new strain of weed a friend had sold her earlier that week, the one with flecks of strange colors and a name that promised an otherworldly high. Curiosity outweighed caution. She paused the documentary and made her way upstairs. Her bedroom was at the end of a long hallway, on the side of the house no one else used anymore. The other rooms, her father's old office and the guest room had become strange little museums of boxes, old clothes, and dust. She passed them without looking in, focusing only on the familiar comfort of her own space. The bong sat on her nightstand like a piece of frozen ocean. 16 inches of hand-blown blue glass swirling upward as if water had been captured mid-motion. In the daylight, it was beautiful. At night, after soaking up the afternoon sun, it held a faint green glow in its flecks whenever the lights went out. That was her favorite part. She packed the bowl with the new strain. The buds had veins of red, blue, and faint pink among the usual green and orange. It looked too pretty to be dangerous, too alive to be anything but a mild escape for a restless teenager. She convinced herself it was just weed, nothing more. Back on the couch, Milo settled against her leg, warm and solid. The documentary resumed narrating some distant tragedy, while the room filled with the herbal haze. Each inhale sent a wave of heaviness through her limbs, while her mind floated loose and slow. Time stretched. The cushions seemed to rise and wrap around her body. The television's flicker melted into a kind of hypnotic lull. Without realizing it, she drifted. When she became aware again, she did not feel rested. She did not feel stoned in a pleasant way. She felt trapped. Her eyes opened to the same dim living room, the same television glow, the same silhouette of Milo curled beside her. But when she tried to move, her body refused. Her arms felt encased in concrete. Her legs might as well have been bolted to the couch. Only her eyes responded, darting frantically from the ceiling to the doorway to the edge of the coffee table. A cold understanding crept in slowly. This was more than grogginess. Her mind screamed at her muscles, and they stayed still. Even breathing felt careful and shallow, as though any sudden effort might snap something vital inside her. Milo remained peaceful, chest rising and falling, blissfully unaware that the person inches away from him was suffocating in invisible restraints. The television's volume seemed to shrink, replaced by a high, constant ringing in her ears. Beyond that ring, deep in the structure of the house, another sound emerged. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Jamie knew that sound. She had grown up in this house. She could have identified each board by tone. That particular creak came from the top of the staircase just outside her bedroom door. Her room was empty. She had left it that way. No one else should have been on the second floor. Another creak followed one step lower this time. Then another, each one measured and unhurried, as if whoever descended had all the time in the world. The ringing in her ears intensified. Her vision sharpened at the edges, while the center of her sight pulsed with each beat of her heart. The stairwell remained hidden from her view by a partial wall. Only the last few steps would become visible when someone reached the bottom. She could not turn her head, but she could see that patch of floor. She fixated on it, every instinct in her body clawing against the paralysis. A hand appeared first. Long, pale fingers curled around the edge of the wall, the skin stretched too tight over knuckles that looked almost bone white. The hand tapped its fingertips slowly against the plaster, one after the other, in a rhythm that felt deliberate rather than thoughtless. It was not the restless fidget of a nervous person. It was the patient tempo of something enjoying the moment. The rest of it followed. A figure stepped into view, towering higher than the room seemed meant to contain. It was close to 8 feet tall, its limbs elongated and slightly wrong, as if someone had pulled a human shape like taffy. Arms hung low enough that the fingertips almost brushed the floor, even when it stood upright. Its shoulders were narrow, its torso thin, and its skin held the pallor of something that did not belong outdoors. The face was what rooted her mind to the moment, like a pin through an insect. Where a normal mouth would end, this one continued. It stretched nearly from one ear to the other, in an unnatural curve that turned upward at the corners. There were no teeth, only exposed gums the color of raw meat, glistening with a wet sheen. Viscous drops of dark red fluid rolled down from the edges and fell silently to the wooden floor, leaving faint stains that spread like oil. The eyes were too small for the size of the skull set deep and entirely rimmed in red. They did not blink. They did not roam. They simply bore down on her unbroken, as though she were the only thing in its universe. It continued to move forward, that slow and measured fingertip tapping, keeping time with each step. The sound of its nails against the floorboards filled the room more completely than the television or the ringing in her ears. Jamie could smell something sweet and rotten, like overripe fruit left in a closed car for days. Her body remained inert, a coffin she couldn't climb out of. Terror crawled up her spine, clawing at a body that refused to fight back. The creature approached the end of the couch. From where she lay, its height became even more staggering. It loomed above her, bending down in a gradual fluid arc, bringing its grotesque face closer and closer to hers. Droplets from its gums landed on the cushion near her shoulder, sinking slowly into the fabric. In the corner of her vision, something faintly luminous pulled at her attention. A thin line of greenish glow emerged just beyond her right hand. Her bong lay half on its side, its glass catching what little light remained in the room. The glowing flecks inside it pulsed softly, like underwater embers. Some stubborn part of her mind seized on that object as if it were a lifeline. She directed every fragment of effort into one command: move the hand. Just the hand. Just a finger. At first, nothing happened. Then, with agonizing slowness, the tips of her fingers twitched. The movement felt like dragging a limb from the bottom of a deep river. She inched her hand toward the glass. The creature watched its expression unchanged, as if mildly curious about what she thought she could accomplish. Her fingertips brushed the cool surface. The contact shocked her, a sudden burst of sensation in the numbness. Fingers closed clumsily around the neck of the bong. The weight of it anchored her, reminded her that she was still inside a body, not just a floating mind. Something snapped, then not in the room but inside her. The paralysis loosened first in her arm, then in her shoulders. She drew the bong up with a jerky motion and brought it crashing down on the side of the creature's head. Glass met flesh with a sickening, dull impact. The bong did not shatter immediately. A deep crack zigzagged through it, and a splatter of thick black fluid erupted where it struck. The substance was darker than the stained gums, almost tar-like, sticking to her hands and spraying across the couch and floor. She hit again and again. Each strike distorted the figure further, warping its features, bending angles that should not have bent, pushing it from humanoid into something unrecognizable. The once distinct mouth collapsed under the blows, and the black fluid spread in grotesque patterns across the room. Some of it splashed onto her face, into her mouth, bitter and metallic. When the glass finally shattered, shards fell into the spreading pool of darkness that used to be the creature's head. Its body twitched once, then stilled. Jamie stood over it, chest heaving, muscles trembling, no longer paralyzed, but far from free. The room tilted. The television flickered. The smell intensified until she thought she might faint. Her vision blurred, then tunneled, then went dark. She woke to white. The ceiling above her was sterile and flat. The steady beep of a monitor kept time near her head. Her arms felt heavy, but this time for a different reason. When she tried to move them, metal clinked. Restraints wrapped around her wrists, securing them to the sides of a hospital bed. Dried substance caked her skin and clothes no longer black, but deep, crusted red. The scent was unmistakable now. Someone stood near the bed, a police officer, expression cautious and watchful. He spoke to her in careful tones, asking if she remembered anything from the previous night. His questions came in a measured rhythm, the kind used with people who are considered dangerous. Memories flooded back in jagged fragments: the couch, the towering figure, the gums, the black fluid, the shattered bong. The officer laid a series of photographs on a tray beside her. For a few seconds, her brain refused to interpret what it saw. The images were taken in the same living room she had been in last night, but the scene was transformed. The couch was soaked in red. The walls were streaked and splattered. On the floor lay a body in a nurse's uniform, almost unrecognizable beneath the damage inflicted. Only the hint of familiar hair and the outline of a badge made her understand who it was. Her mother had never reached the hospital. In the reality of those photographs, there was no towering creature, no inhuman mouth, no black blood. There was only a human body, destroyed by repeated frenzied blows with a heavy glass object. There were only marks that matched the shattered remnants of the bong the investigators had bagged as evidence. The officer's fingers tapped lightly against his notepad as he waited for her response, each tap landing with an eerie familiarity. The rhythm echoed the slow pattern she had heard on the wall and the floor the night before. For a moment, her mind overlaid the monstrous grin onto his face, stretching his mouth impossibly wide in her imagination. She could no longer separate what she had seen from what she had done. The house in Eugene, the couch, the shadows, the drifting smoke, every piece of that night had become a haunted loop in her mind. Maybe it had been drug-induced psychosis. Maybe something truly paranormal had crawled out of her subconscious and taken shape. Or maybe the horror lived entirely inside her from the beginning, waiting for the right combination of loneliness and chemicals to step into the light. Years later, people would tell the story in fragments. Some would call it a tragic crime. Others would call it a drug-fueled breakdown. And some, hearing only parts of it, would whisper that maybe it was a ghost story, a haunted house, a paranormal entity using a 16-year-old girl as its vessel. For Jamie, it remained all of those things at once. A horror carved into her memory. A scary story retold on late-night forums by strangers who would never meet her. A monster with a toothless grin that might have been real or might have been the most terrifying reflection of herself. Whether the thing she fought was a creature from beyond or a nightmare born inside her own mind, one truth stayed with her: some demons do not need abandoned buildings or graveyards to appear. Sometimes they sit on your own couch with you, waiting inside the glow of a glass pipe, ready to turn an ordinary living room into the setting of a story that will never stop replaying. Story 5. The boxes left at my door. Marcus had always assumed danger came with noise. Sirens, shouts, breaking glass. Dramatic things that announced themselves long before they reached you. But the real threat in his life arrived quietly, in the shape of a man he didn't know, carrying a plain cardboard box that looked too ordinary to matter. It happened on a warm Friday in late June. Marcus was home alone in the duplex he shared with Elise, a small rental tucked at the very edge of a quiet neighborhood where the streets curved like lazy rivers and everyone's mailboxes leaned slightly from years of summer storms. Elise worked a double shift that day, and the house felt heavy without her, stripped of its usual noise and warmth. He had planned to use the afternoon to finish an online certification course, the kind of tedious thing he kept putting off, until deadlines stared him down. Sometime around 1 p.m, a loud knock rattled the door. The sound was firm enough to snap him out of his concentration. He expected to see a delivery van outside or the usual postal truck idling on the curb. Instead, when he opened the door, Sunlight spilled onto a man standing alone on the porch with a cardboard box held awkwardly in both hands. The man looked to be in his mid-40s, scruffy around the jaw, wearing an old maroon polo worn to the point of fading. He did not wear a uniform. He had no scanner, no badge, nothing that indicated he worked for any delivery service. He simply held the box out with a strange sense of urgency, as if handing it over was the only task keeping him alive. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing there with the box in his hands, puzzled and uneasy. The man didn't head toward a vehicle. He chose instead to walk down the street on foot, disappearing between two houses with a slowness that made Marcus's stomach tighten. The box had his name written on top in thick black marker. Marcus Ward. Nothing else. No address. No shipping label. No company logo. Just his name. Inside, there was only a single Polaroid. In the photo, Marcus stood on his own front porch, taken from an angle just a few steps away. His posture, his shirt, his expression, they all matched the exact moment he had opened the door only seconds earlier. Someone had taken the picture the instant before he'd laid eyes on the man. Something cold crept into the back of his mind. He double-locked the door and tried to convince himself it had to be a prank. Maybe one of the neighbors. Maybe someone messing around. But when he checked through the window, the street was empty, except for the slow sway of tall grass and the low hum of cicadas. The unease stayed with him for the rest of the day. He checked the locks more times than he cared to admit. He waited for Elise to come home, hoping she would laugh and tell him it was nothing. When she finally arrived around 8, he showed her the Polaroid. She didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss it. The worry in her eyes told him everything he already feared. Night settled thick and humid around their duplex. They placed the strange box in the outdoor trash bin and tried to return to normal. Elise sat with her laptop in the bedroom, while Marcus lingered in the living room, unable to shake the feeling that something unseen hovered just outside the windows. Sometime after 2:30 in the morning, a new sound broke the stillness. It came from the front porch. A heavy thump, quiet, but unmistakably intentional. Marcus froze. He strained his ears, but the neighborhood remained silent, except for the occasional buzz of cicadas. Against every instinct telling him not to, he approached the front window, lifted the blinds just enough to see the porch, and felt the world tilt beneath him. Another box sat directly in front of the door. Bigger this time. He didn't step outside. He didn't need to. He already knew it was for him. Police arrived within minutes after he called, but the night had already swallowed whoever placed the box there. The officer opened the box carefully outside. Inside lay a stack of Polaroids, dozens of them. Each image captured their duplex from different angles. The backyard, the side gate, the kitchen window, the view between the slats of their fence. And the final photo, buried beneath all the others, showed Marcus in the living room from the exact spot he was sitting earlier that night. Someone had been standing outside the darkened window camera, pressed to the glass, watching him in silence. The officer's demeanor changed instantly. He told Marcus and Elise to pack a bag and leave the house for the night. They drove to Elise's mother's place across town, both of them too shaken to talk on the way. The next morning brought more questions than answers. Police canvassed the neighborhood, but found no footprints, no witnesses, no signs of forced entry anywhere on the property. They asked Marcus if he had noticed any workers, service people, or unfamiliar faces in the past week. He mentioned nothing unusual, because nothing unusual had happened until the boxes arrived. 2 days later, a detective called with new information. A homeowner several blocks away had reported a man wandering through backyards, claiming to be with a pest control company. He carried no equipment besides a clipboard and a camera. He said he was documenting signs of rodents, but left before anyone asked him for identification. The description matched the man Marcus had seen. That same afternoon, police detained a suspect a few neighborhoods over. His name was Raymond Hale, 48, previously employed as a maintenance worker for a property management company. A bag of keys was found in his vehicle, along with stacks of cardboard boxes, each one labeled with house numbers from different streets, including Marcus's. Inside one of the boxes was yet another collection of Polaroids. These were different. These were personal. They showed Marcus and Elise sleeping in their bed on separate nights. There had never been forced entry marks on any door or window of their duplex. Nothing had been broken or tampered with. The detective explained that some of the rental units in their area still had older locks, ones that hadn't been changed in years, and could be opened with old master keys issued to maintenance staff long ago. The knowledge made Marcus's skin crawl. Someone had walked into their home at night while they slept. Someone had stood inches from them, camera flashing quietly in the dark, while they remained unaware. He and Elise moved out within the month. The landlord never argued. No amount of cleaning or repainting could change what the walls had witnessed. The duplex felt permanently contaminated, as though the air itself had absorbed the presence of the man who had wandered through it freely. Even years later, Marcus could not look at a cardboard box on anyone's porch without remembering the first Polaroid, the one that captured him just seconds before he opened the door, completely unaware of the man watching him from a few feet away. He often replayed that moment, wondering how long the stranger had stood there before knocking, wondering if he explored the backyard that same day, wondering whether he had already been inside the house long before revealing himself. The terror didn't come from the photos. It came from the realization that the man had chosen to hand one of them to him, directly placing it in his hands with a quiet certainty, as if offering a preview of a horror Marcus didn't yet understand. Some people fear ghosts or the supernatural, but Marcus learned the truth firsthand. The most frightening stories are often the ones where nothing paranormal exists at all. Just a man, a camera, a key, and the certainty that he will return until someone stops him.